Okay, well, firstly, I'd like to thank you for coming along today to this year's International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples Roundtable for 2022. The theme for this year is the role of Indigenous women in the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge. And I've chosen this year to revolve that around the Mana Wahine Inquiry in New Zealand. So just to kick off with the acknowledgement of country, we acknowledge and respect traditional owners of the lands, the Darug, the Gundungurra, Darawal, Wiradjuri and Bundjalung people of the Aotearoa nation on which we live and work. We pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the traditional teachings concerning land, waterways and community that have transpired here for thousands of years. We further extend that respect to all Aboriginal, Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders leaders today, tomorrow and always. We continue to value the generations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait peoples and what they embed within our community, and acknowledge their sovereignty was never ceded, always was and always will be Indigenous lands. So just on the note of housekeeping today, this session will be recorded as I mentioned. You do not need to have your camera on if you do not feel comfortable. Also, feel free to use the chat function if you do not wish to have your voice recorded. We are currently entering an Indigenous space and we will not be navigating our feelings and experiences for the colonised audience. This additionally is a very heavy and potentially triggering topic for many of the world's Indigenous people. So if anyone else chooses to join us today, please give each other time to speak and articulate themselves properly before speaking. And just take a moment to breathe as we go through this process. Breathing is a privilege that many of the world's Indigenous people do not have. So firstly, I just wanted to show you a brief video as to why we observe the International Day for the world's Indigenous people and why it's so important. So I just start that now.
The International Day for the World's Indigenous Peoples. It's celebrated on 9th August every year. But why do we observe this day? Is Indigenous culture really that important that we have to celebrate it with a special day? Are they more important than mainstream ethnic groups? Well, let's put that into perspective. There are around 370 million Indigenous people worldwide, representing only around 5% of the global population. Yet they account for 5,000 distinct cultures and speak an overwhelming majority of the world's 7,000 known languages. This means that Indigenous peoples, they hold most of the world's cultural diversity, even though they constitute just a fraction of its population. And that diversity, it brings with it priceless knowledge. There's knowledge about our ancestry, about our environment and our place in it, even about our belief systems and our social structures. And this knowledge, it's often hyper-local. It's winnowed through generations and specific to a particular place and to a particular people.
Living on the piece of land that we have managed for thousands of years, we have developed and accumulated a vast range of body of knowledge. And this knowledge, we have applied it, whether it's in our traditional institutions, governance systems, in our ways of resource management, cultural expressions, science, etc., etc. I see today that we also can present a lot of solutions to the problems that the world is facing.
So preserving this kind of knowledge and drawing lessons from them, it could be invaluable to charting a better future for humankind as a species.
So we are knowledge holders and we want to also contribute, and we do not want to lose this.
But though invaluable, Indigenous people, they account for a third of the world's extremely poor rural population. And with far less political representation than mainstream ethnic groups, they are vulnerable to exploitation, especially when it comes to their land. Globalization also means that ideas and systems and languages of mainstream society, they're spreading faster and wider, diluting the culture of Indigenous peoples who are very often under pressure to assimilate. That's a lot of diversity, a lot of knowledge, under serious threat. So why do we observe this day? For Indigenous peoples, it's a chance to celebrate their own cultures and be proud of their place in modern society. mainstream society, it's a chance to understand the challenges that these communities continue to face, especially when it comes to land rights and access to education. But more than that, it's a chance to appreciate just how much we can learn from them.
So that gives us a little bit of an idea as to why we actually observe this day and why the UN thought it was so important that we have the space to celebrate the world's Indigenous people. So, like I said previously, this year's theme is the role of Indigenous women in the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge. Indigenous women are the backbone of Indigenous people's communities and play a crucial role in the preservation and transmission of traditional ancestral knowledge. They have an integral collective and community role as carers of natural resources and keepers of scientific knowledge. Many Indigenous women are also taking the lead in defending lands and territories and advocating for Indigenous people's collective rights worldwide. However, despite the crucial role that Indigenous women play in their communities as breadwinners, caretakers, knowledge keepers, leaders, and human rights defenders, they often suffer from intersecting levels of discrimination based on gender, class, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. Their right to self-determination, self-governance, and control of resources and ancestral lands has been violated over centuries. So just to give you a little bit of an idea in more of a, So just to give us a bit more of an idea of what it's like in a regional context, I'm just going to show you a brief history of what's happened since the Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand, just to give you an idea that this is what's happened in regards to, there's actually treaty there that should be giving some sort of protections towards the Maori people of New Zealand. But this is exactly what's happened, and then we'll break it down even further in regards to how this has affected their women more oversightly. So.
The Treaty of Waitangi was supposed to create a partnership between Māori and the Crown, but different understandings of the treaty and breaches of it have caused conflict. Numerous attempts to settle land disputes and treaty grievances led to more conflict, including the New Zealand Wars. During that conflict, the Crown invaded Waikato in 1863. They confiscated over 3 million acres of Māori land to pay for the war. It was an example of land confiscation that would continue over the next 150 years. Like in 1953, when the government introduced a law preventing Māori building on their own land and forced them to move from rural areas into the cities. Land not occupied or used was then declared wasteland and taken by the government. When the treaty was signed, Māori owned more than 66 million acres of land. By 1975, almost 97% had been sold or taken. It was not just the loss of land that caused disputes. Social and economic disparity grew. Despite fighting for the Commonwealth, Māori servicemen who returned from World War I were not entitled to the same benefits as Pākehā. And in the 1930s, unemployed Māori were paid half of what was given to Pākehā. In 1975, the Waitangi Tribunal was set up to hear future grievances against the Crown, but few were investigated or resolved. 10 years later, following protests at Bastion Point and the Raglan Golf Course, the government began to look into any alleged breach of the treaty since 1840. Since then, Māori and the government of the day have been trying to address some of the unsettling aspects of New Zealand's colonial legacy.
So just saw there a little bit of the complexities that we're dealing with as Māori since the Treaty of Waitangi to current day. So basically the Treaty of Waitangi was put together as an official document that said that the Crown was going to respect Māori and Māori was to respect the Crown. But unfortunately, as happens in most colonized spaces, that hasn't been the case. And that's what we're talking about here right now in terms of firstly the Treaty of Waitangi and secondly the Mana Wahine Inquiry. So what do we know about the Treaty of Waitangi and the women that were involved? just 13 women out of approximately 500 signatories have been identified as women. These women were chiefs in their own right. More women were more likely to sign than actually confirmed, as Maori names are often gender neutral, and there's also evidence of women who tried to sign but were stopped by Pakeha male settlers who did not recognise their authority. That there in itself gives us a lot of insight into their cultural competency at that particular point in time when they're trying to sign treaty and policy into play and they don't even know the cultural significance of the opposing party. Instead, their husbands, brothers, and other males were encouraged to sign for them. Some male chiefs refused to sign altogether, seeing this as an affront. So basically, the male chiefs are saying that, you know what, if you're not going to let our wahine sign this, then I'm not going to sign it either, because you're not respecting them and their authority. So, yeah, one of the women who signed the treaty at Kapiti on April 19, 1840 is actually, there's actually educators and researchers that are descendants of these people that did sign the treaty. And that's the thing that we're seeing these 13 women as our founding mothers, as the prevailing idea at the time that British officials that only men could sign because they had only ever dealt with men. The Pakeha women were not in the public sphere as Maori women were. As we understand, the women did not get the right to vote until at least the 1950s, 1960s, something like that, even in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where women first got the vote. So we need to put into consideration that for the Māori, women always had the same level of authority, but within the British sphere, that didn't happen. So at the time of the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, the concept that women could own land, make decisions, have their own seats at the table to make these decisions was beyond their comprehension. In European culture, women were oppressed and their place was considered to be at home with the children or in the kitchen. Te Rangiparea, who was known as the Queen of the South and later on being baptized as Te Kuini, was a chief, strategist, master negotiator, composer of waiata, which is the tribal songs, and a tribal leader with control over Ngāti Toa and Ngāti Rakawa property, people and land. So Ngāti Toa and Ngāti Rakawa are the areas that are now currently known as Wellington. While not all Maori women could have this influence, some did. So when the treaty was signed, they knew settlers were coming. They knew that there will be more, but at that time, Maori outnumbered the settlers 40-1. Within a decade, just 10 years, that had equalized. So what is the Mana Wahine Inquiry? In 2015, the Waitangi Tribunal announced a comprehensive program of Kaupapa inquiries. So Kaupapa is basically a Māori word that means, the closest translation would be that this is like a Bill of Rights or even question time within government. It's a series of inquiries like that. Very, very similar to a royal commission in a way. So the Kaupapa inquiries deal with issues of national significance which require the whole of New Zealand government response. In December 2018, the Waitangi Tribunal formally initiated the Mana Wahine Kaupapa inquiry into claims alleging prejudice to Wahine Māori arising from the Crown breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi, both historical, pre-September 92, and in contemporary times, meaning during the inquiry. As we saw in the previous video, they were already investigating other breaches of the treaty that had happened in regards to land and rights, and also pay disparity. But this particular inquiry is more related to the way that they have treated their women and their women's knowledges post the treaty. So breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi with damage to customary roles and relationship with their whenua being their places of birth, their whakapapa being their ancestry, and the mataranga, with serious potential consequences for their social, economic, cultural, and spiritual well-being, and their access to leadership roles. At the heart of these claims is the loss of rangatiratanga, which is the absolute sovereignty, and the social, economic, environmental, and cultural loss that has occurred from this loss of recognition of the wahine rangatiratanga, meaning that the superior sovereignty of women under Māori. Their roles, their responsibilities as Māori are crucial to the Māori community. The iwi hapu, which is basically the same as if you're looking at Indigenous Australian, it will be the country and nation, the marae, and the whānau. The marae is the spiritual home, and whānau being family. Some of the themes across these claims include social sector, so access to education, health, justice, family, supports in regards to sexual violence, and housing. Cultural, being leadership and decision-making roles. Economic, meaning access to employment, including the wahine Māori pay gap and pay equity. And the environment, being research management and land tenure. So what does mana and wahine mean? So mana means prestige, authority, control, power, influence, status, spiritual power, charisma. They're the main parts of it. But mana is the supernatural force in a person, place, or object. Mana goes hand in hand with tapu, being the sacred. One affects the other. The more prestigious is the event, person, or object, the more it is surrounded by sacredness and mana. So wahine, at its simplest and most common understanding, makes woman, women, male, female or wife. You combine the two, Mana Wahine is both potent and full of possibilities. So, once we're goddesses, opening the inquiry, the original claimant Rebecca Evans said that women played a key role in Māori society and the crown had eroded their power, status, and authority. The denial of their mana, which began with the refusal of Pakeha to let Māori women sign the treaty, had destroyed their way of life, causing Māori women to sink to the bottom of the social statistics. Māori cosmology supports the pre-colonial status of women. Gods were not only men. The first Pasahina Hitama was a woman. She had life breathed into her by Tani, which is one of the original gods within Māori mythology. Bore him children, then descended beneath the earth in a rage to become Hina Nia Tepo, the mighty goddess of the underworld. She crushed Maui to death when he dared slither between her legs, seeking eternal life. Mahuira had the power to create fire, and Papatua Nuku is the earth's mother. We're here today to recognize those goddesses. It's non-negotiable that Maori women should have their power. It's non-negotiable that Maori women should have control. And it's non-negotiable that Maori women should have authority, Evans said. That authority must be based on our own tikanga. Tikanga is a word that means our law, as in L-O-R-E. So our values, and I get this one thing for our future, Aotearoa will be a better place for our daughters, granddaughters, and people. And the main reason why she's saying that is because if you look at the way that life was pre-colonial compared to now, women then were basically seen to have the exact same social status as men. They were seen as their equals in all ways. There was literally no disparity between male and female. You could hold authority. You could, honestly, Māori is more of a matriarchal culture than what it is male. You would, like, if you ever dealt with those communities, you would know that you have more fear of God into you by the aunties coming after you than what you would if your dad was coming home. So for them to basically strip Maori women of this right and try to, like, I think in a way is to say that they were too much, and that we couldn't deal with women that had that much authority and power, and they had full knowing and being of themselves. So Ms. Evans had waited almost 30 years for the claim to see the light of day. And during that time, she had to witness her people, her Maori women, continue to be imprisoned, failed by the education system, had their babies taken by the state, and struggled to feed their families, had poor outcomes, and were beaten up in their homes in disproportionate numbers. So to further explore the relationships behind Mana Wahine, the marginalization of Maori women's reproductive processes and practices had a direct impact on Mana Wahine Warrior knowledge. So basically, when we're talking warrior knowledge, we're talking about their spiritual knowledge and their spirit within them. So with the introduction of Christianity, colonizers were quick to impose shame upon the reproductive roles of women, thus disregarding the power and tapu sacredness of the wharetanga, meaning the womb. So prior to that, there was no medicalization of female reproductive processes. There wasn't no seeing birth as something that needs to happen within a hospital. There was nothing in regards to seeing menstruation as something that was dirty. There wasn't any of that. So when Christian missionary discourses ascribed to the cultural mores of European women to Maori women very early on, the effects of Mana Wahine knowledge, particularly in the spiritual wisdom, were immense, and these discourses portrayed Maori women as wanton, immoral, and undisciplined. Before European settlers arrived on these shores, Maori, like I said previously, Maori society was not staunchly patriarchal as some believe. Men and women each had their own roles, but neither was superior to the other. Traditionally, it was whakapapa or lineage that mattered in Maori society. So if you are Maori and you get asked what is your whakapapa, you need to be able to trace your ancestry all the way back. And there's also something that comes alongside that called papea. And papea is, if they ask you, like, what is your papea, you need to be able to tell them who are your tribes people, where's your closest river, under what mountain were you born under. So for me personally, it will be I am Ngāti Toa, I am from Hutt River, and my mountain is Taranaki. So things like that, and that's what they were looking at when they were looking at status. They were more looking at, like, what group of people do you belong to? There wasn't any men up in the throne, like, controlling everybody. There wasn't any of that. It was like, whose family to which you belong. So when we're talking, like, when it was whakapapa or lineage that mattered in Maori society and who and where you were descended from, that was a unique and valued aspect of Maori culture. But with Christianity came patriarchy, and women's roles were shiftily altered. In 1901, Tohunga Suppression Act, perhaps one of the most aggressive assaults on warrior knowledge. It's at its core, the act defined that it was considered essential and legitimate knowledge. So basically, as a result of that act, they decided what's important and what's not important for Maori to know, and their spiritual knowledges were considered as superstitions or tales on the pathway to reality, and Christianity was seen as the end all and as the closer to godliness and goodness. Historically, our differences have been defined for us, usually by non-Maori men and others. It has been portrayed predominantly in negative terms, that is, Maori were and are different, and therefore somehow lacking because they were not white. Mana Wahine, as art, as theory, as method, and as practice, recognizes and provides for this in-betweenness and enables the exploration of diverse Maori realities from a position of power. We need to actively celebrate the contributions and affirm the mana of Maori women, that Mana Wahine, meaning their female ancestors who have gone before us, that Wahine Toa, meaning our warrior women, who give strength to our culture and people today, and those Kohiro, which is our girls, and our Mokopuna, which is our grandchildren who are being born now, and who will be born in the future to fulfill our dreams. So what's currently happening within this space? There's been 3 Kaupapa, which are contextual hearings that have been held in 2021. There's one in early February, one in late February, and another one that's happened in July. And there's this 4th one happening mid-July. So that would have just happened a couple of weeks ago now, and we got a couple more coming up in the following weeks. Next one in August, and then also September. You can also see here that there has been no discrepancy between most of them being held in the North or Lower Island. The one in Lower Hutt is, like I said before, is around Wellington, so that's North Island. And then the second one in the near Hawa Marae in Christchurch, again, the South Island. But one thing I do want to note, and this is very important when it comes to these inquiries, is that each of the inquiries is actually held on a marae. So if you're looking at it from an Indigenous Australian context, they're being held on country. So these huis, which are like considered important meetings, are all happening on marae. They're all happening within the cultural context, which, as we looked at previously, the Treaty of Waitangi was not signed with cultural competency at all. So for them to be able to do that is really something that's worth marking. So Judge Reeves has begun the inquiry with the exploration of the tikanga of Mana Wahine and pre-colonial understanding of Wahine in Te Ao Māori. So she's basically gone in there, had a look at it. So, okay, well, according to your law, what does Mana Wahine mean? And what was your understanding of the power of women pre-colonization? So they're also doing an inquiry on the directions of research reports, and the judge has released directions on the 2nd of June last year, confirming that the tribunals commissioned research reports for the Mana Wahine inquiry and outlining the next steps for the research program. She's also confirmed that the original 4 research results that initially proposed by the tribunal will be commissioned by the tribunal, along with 2 further research projects, as requested by the claimants on employment and contemporary social issues. We expect to see some project drafts for the next 6 research projects to be circulated to parties for feedback, and project briefs will be finalised and commissioned by the end of 2021 and expected to be fully completed by late 2022 for comment. My belief is that the reason why it hasn't been fully completed by the end of 2021 is due to COVID. Naturally, a lot of the maraes would have shut down during the lockdowns and things like that. So naturally, the courts also shut down during that time, as did the maraes, as a lot of them were actually housing people that needed to be isolated at that particular point in time. So I'm guessing that's why it's going into its 2nd year at the moment. But at the same time, as we can see, there is actually 6 research projects that are happening as a result of this particular inquiry. This is really something that generally doesn't happen within Royal Commission inquiries. So it's really important to note that the judge isn't just making a ruling on this. They're researching it. They're seeing what was happening prior to colonialism. How did colonialism affect Maori women and Maori like the community overall, especially in the employment and the contemporary economic issues in that particular space that's being fully looked at. So at the moment, the briefs are including like focusing on the theme of protection and impacts of Crown actions. So that will be things like we mentioned in the previous video about the seizement of land and things like that. So you've got policy, practice, and legislation on the ability of Wahine Māori to exercise raratikanga. So that's basically their overall sovereignty over their role, status, and knowledge from 1840 to 1950. So that will be prior to being able to vote and for women to be seen as somewhat equals within Western society. So basically looking at that whole pre-colonization idea that women were the same as men, they were able to hold land, they were able to hold property, they had their own authority and things like that prior to 1950, where it was considered post the suffragette movement in New Zealand that women had more power. So overview report 2, focusing on the theme of equity and impact of Crown policies, practices and legislations on disparities of outcomes and well-being for Wahine Māori from 1950 to 2000. So that one there will be dealing with things like the pay gap, health and social status, access to mental health, also looking at the challenges that have arisen from the confiscation of land, and also looking at all the issues that have happened as part of women not having their voices the way that they did traditionally. Because that's the thing that within Maori circles, it's not just men and women that have equal voice and standing to each other. They also children, the tamariki that they refer to them as. But that's the thing, even children are able to take part within adult conversation and have their voices heard. So to take that into a Western context where children are to be seen but not heard, especially as a young person growing up, and particularly as a young woman growing up, where traditionally these knowledges were shared amongst each other in more of a organic, like grandmother passes it down to mother, mother passes it down to child kind of vibe. For that to not be happening due to the Crown and their interference, that's where that outcome for well-being is vastly different. And that's where it also comes to the contemporary justice issues, where they're looking at for a period between 1990 to 2018, because that's the thing, that with the loss of law, culture, language, and things like that, it raises a lot of questions as to the person's, what we call in Māori Tauranga Wewe, which is their sense of belonging. And the thing is that if they don't feel that they belong anywhere, then 9 out of 10, they're going to create a bit of a ruckus, get themselves in trouble with the law and other various parties as well. But that's the thing, that for them to be looking at these briefs as a more of a holistic approach, it really gives a lot more representation, access to leadership opportunities for Wahine Māori, especially when they're looking at what was and what is currently, and they're looking at the disparity between those two areas and how they can probably not fix it, because it's been over centuries now and it's very hard to fix ancestry. But if they make a move from this point forward, how can they support the acknowledgement of those previous knowledges and acknowledge where they stuffed up previously, and how to involve those conversations, like both in the workplace, but in the home, and also in communities. One thing that you might realize if you do go to New Zealand is that they're a lot more open about speaking their Indigenous language over there than what it is here in Australia. One of the reasons for that also will be that Australia has a lot more Indigenous languages than what the Māori do. Māori have te Eo Māori, but the difference is that depending on if you're North Island or South Island, the dialect changes slightly. but the overall language doesn't change that much. It's not like in Indigenous Australia where if you have someone that speaks Wiradjuri, they won't understand what they're speaking in Darawal or in Darug or in other areas of the country. So that's a very big consideration that needs to be made there as well. But they are also looking into the access for leadership, governance, political and decision-making roles, particularly within the state Center for Women. And that's just a whole bunch of words that I've pretty much explained all the way through. But yeah, is there any questions that you might have about any of that?
Just turning baby thing back on again.
Yeah.
No, it's interesting because my degree is in anthropology, so I've been studying over the 3 years different cultures and societies. And having been to New Zealand 3 times as a young person, or very young, I must say, I have a little bit of, I guess, window into some of the Māori culture.
Yep.
That was displayed mainly to the tourists and Westerners, not behind scenes. But I didn't understand a lot of this, and I didn't understand that it was the position and the leadership that women had within the Māori society.
Yeah.
I didn't know that, so that's good information and knowledge to learn.
It's always a learning curve, especially when you're looking at things from a different lens, especially when you're doing anthropology, or myself, I come from a sociology background. So to have that opposite flip of the coin, where when you're usually seeing things in mainstream media and they're about a certain community, whether it be Māori or some other Indigenous culture, is usually shown with a negative light. And that's the thing that I personally, when I chose to do this one, I was like, you know what? I think it's really important for people to be able to see the reasons behind why our men are acting in this way. That it's not just a matter of them completely losing the plot and coming across violent. Because that's the thing that when we're looking at media, that's what the media wants to portray, because it comes under this whole concept of them being savage and uncivilized and things like that. But what we need to be looking at is are they really savage and uncivilized? Or are they speaking up for their women in spaces where they traditionally were able to, but for reasons unknown, Western society has decided that women are no longer allowed a voice?
I think a lot of it stems from that, but just what you said. It's the colonial imperial ideology that Western patriarchy structure, where the male has dominance, the male can speak, the woman is submissive, as you said, in the kitchen or looking after the kids.
Yeah.
And my experience with Indigenous Australian women is, although they have a very different family structure to Western people, the grandmothers play a vital role in their society, in their structure, in their culture, and it's often the grandmothers who the younger people defer to get knowledge of certain things or activities that they can't understand. Yeah, understand.
Yeah, but that's another really important point too, that even in Maori language, the word that we use for knowledge is hinengaru. And it starts with the prefix hine, which is exactly the same as what you see in wahine. Yeah. So it's literally predisposed that all the knowledges that Maori hold are offered to women. It's not that's the thing, that anything that you see ending with the word tani, like T-A-N-E, is usually male, and it's usually put towards the men, that's men's business. So it's very similar in context to Indigenous Australia, where there's men's business and women's business. And it's usually dictated by the language that you use in that particular context. So when we're looking at that, it's also very important to take into consideration that Western culture nullified that language and tried to sweep it under the rug, because the moment that they take away language, they take away the roles. Because once they make everything like chair, table, tree, you can't, like when you hear that, you can't tell whether it's men's or women's business just by those nouns. But if you're going like whakatawani, and then you're going hinangalo and takaranga, and like I'm just picking words, but
Yes.
that's the thing, that like if you're doing it that way, and you can tell that, like even the words like uncle and auntie in Maori is matua and whea. Like you can tell just by hearing them which one's male and which one's female. So if they're trying to nullify the language and nullify the social roles, taking that language away, firstly, it destroys culture. Secondly, it destroys like the tikanga, which is the law, totally destroys that. So when we're looking at the Mana Wahine Inquiry and them saying that as of the Treaty of Waitangi, this is what they've done to their women, you can't really dispute it. You really can't dispute it, because that's the thing, that the Crown signed that treaty saying that we want to work with you. But the only thing that they've done is basically say, we'll work with you if you look and act like us.
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing in a lot of colonized societies. It's not just Maori, and it's not just New Zealand, it's like global. So usually they go, oh yeah, we want to work with you, but you must like shit like us. But that's where things become really, really messy, because the chiefs signed that treaty with the expectation it was a come as you are kind of situation. And it's been anything but, because that's the thing, that you don't just look at the Treaty of Waitangi as one singular document. Then you got to also look at the Treaty of Waitangi, then you look at the Dawn Raids and things like that as well, where they're like post-colonial manifestations of what the Crown put the original Maori chiefs through. And it's just been a continuous process of downtreading by downtreading. And that's the thing, that it's now become, as part of the inquiry, that they're going, hold on, wait a minute, you said that you were going to work with us, but you've done these things on our land that we never gave up. So how dare you come into our home and think that you can act like you live here? That's basically the way that you look at it. If you look at it in a Western context, like the land is their house, and you just like, you weren't invited, and then you just banged open the door and then you went. And it's not fair, it's not just, and it's downright rude. Like if somebody did that to somebody's home, you would expect like a couple of cops on the door going like, well, he broke and enter. Like that's not right. Like shouldn't be doing that. But the thing is that when we look at it from an Indigenous context, people just go, well, they weren't exactly doing anything with the land. You know, and like personally, I don't see there being a great deal of difference between looking at somebody's home currently and looking at the way that the country was pre-colonization, because that's the thing, that they had their structures within their families and things like that. And it comes back again to that Indigenous Australian thing that they got dealt with like the taking of their sovereignty, because hey, good old James Cook decided to call terra nullis when he didn't even go on the land. Not another conversation for another day, but that's the thing, that like he didn't even get on the land, and he wants to claim terra nullius and say that like these people aren't doing anything with it, like just because he didn't see any farms and things like that. But the difference is when it comes to the Treaty of Waitangi is that the Crown actually came on the land, actually held a meeting in Waikato, sorry. And they met with the chiefs, and they could see that they had family dynamics, and this is the way that they do their laws and their day-to-day functions. And they're like, yeah, we want to work with you. And then they went completely against it. And
I know
Yeah.
it's a recurring story, isn't it? It happened in New Zealand, it happened in Australia, it happened in Hawaii, it happened in the Pacific Islands. It's a recurring
It's a recurring thing. It's a recurring thing. And that's the thing, that when you look at it in the way of that happened in Australia, happened in New Zealand, happened in the islands and Hawaii, like when you look at it that way, it's mostly the Pacific Islanders. Like, you know what I mean? Like, even though most people don't want to put like Māori and Indigenous Australia into that box, and like rightfully so, they're all their different like cultures and things. But the thing is that when you look at it, it just seems like they decided to go, well, Hawaii is easy because it's off the coast of like America, so let's go for that. And then they're just gone, oh, these are tiny little islands, so they don't know what they're doing with that. Let's just take them all. And it's beyond frustrating, because that's the thing, that like Tonga and Samoa and the Cook Islanders and all those countries are so rich in their own law of their lands, and the people have such a rich and defined culture, and people have just walked all over it with no regard to like what came before. So
I know, and to me, it just epitomizes the slowed erosion and destruction of all cultural knowledge and replacing it with Eurocentric, colonial, imperial ideology. You have to behave, act, think, and do what we do the way we do it.
Yep.
And we're not even going to consider whatever you think.
That's it. And that's always been a problem, like especially when like you just go like from one particular ideal to just go completely Eurocentric. That's always going to be a problem, because you're not inviting people to the table to tell their story. And the moment that you're not including people at the table, that's when you're losing the richness. But
yeah, it's sad. To me, it's sad.
Oh, always the way. But thank you very much for coming along today, Phil. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you. It was a very enlightening discussion, and I learned things that I didn't know.
Yeah,
Which is
I was
good.
really trying to like not use too many of my Māori words, but it's very difficult for me to speak on a subject that's so close to me as a Māori woman myself without using the language. That's why I was like, okay, say the word and then describe what the word means and try and give the picture. But yeah, it's very difficult to have these kinds of conversations without having the language there. And then secondly, as a white passing Māori woman, it's difficult as well, because that's the thing, that I usually have to have the conversation with people that it's like coffee. No matter how much milk you add to it, at some point it's still coffee before it goes all completely milk. So
No, yeah, I appreciate it, and I didn't understand some of the words, but I understand.
That's why I put the glossary at the end too, just so like, just in case you pick it up later. But if you want, I can actually send you through the slides, so you can have a copy of it.
Can you send me the slide? Because then I got that glossary of terms, and I can
absolutely
put it in my notes.
Absolutely, because then you can also put it with the reading that's on our views this week as well, if you want more knowledge about it there, because I was just noting that we only have an hour, so I didn't want to go too in depth into it. But I definitely can send you the slides as well as the reading as well, so that'll be cool.
That'll be good. Thank you.
No problem. I'm just going to stop the recording.